are we in a simulation? Which could be a simulation on an alien computer, which could be a simulation on any number of substrates. There are some arguments to think that we are.
Could the nightmare really be true? Could it be that what's outlined in the cult classic The Matrix isn't just science fiction, but a glimpse into our actual reality? Imagine this. What if everything around you, your job, your family, the sky above you, the ground beneath your feet, is nothing more than code? A simulation created by forces we don't understand. Maybe by an advanced civilization, maybe by future very advanced and powerful artificial intelligence, maybe even by entities we can't yet imagine. This isn't just a wild theory from the depths of Reddit or a Hollywood plotline. Some of the world's leading scientists take this idea very seriously. One of them is Roman Yampolsky, a prominent computer scientist and artificial intelligence safety expert. He argues that the odds that we are not living in a simulation are actually vanishingly small. And more disturbingly, if we are in a simulation, could we hack our way out? Would we even want to? In this episode, I'm discussing this mind-bending possibility with Dr. Waku, a futurist and cybersecurity expert who, while skeptical, admits he can't rule it out. Together, we'll explore the unsettling logic behind the simulation hypothesis, what it means for the future of AI, and what might happen if we ever found the escape hatch. Could artificial intelligence, the very force that may have created our prison, also become the key to breaking free? And even deeper, if we're just code, what does that mean for free will, morality, love, and death? So buckle up. This is not just a conversation, it's a dive into the ultimate question of existence. Welcome to the Mind Blowers podcast. What do you think the actual likelihood is that this world is already just a simulation of an AI? I've heard some, I don't know if I would call it conspiracy theorists, but I mean, that thought has been entertained by quite a few people now. Do you think it's likely?
I interviewed Roman Yampolsky, who's a professor, and he was arguing very strongly that we're in a simulation. He had some interesting ideas. I think calling it a simulation within an AI is kind of the wrong phrase because it would exist out, right? You just need to simulate one and see what happens. So that's kind of an interesting argument. And it could just be that life is extremely unlikely to evolve, right? And fine, that's also an explanation. But and there's also the hypothesis, because we're only about 1% of the way through the life. 14 billion years have passed or whatever. That's about 1% of the time that habitable planets are likely to exist, which means that we're extremely early. So that might mean that everybody gets wiped out by some expanding civilization in the near-term future, which is why we're so early, because we couldn't exist later, essentially. So there are all kinds of, philosophical possibilities here. But I think that to me, some of the most interesting arguments for why we're in a simulation are things like the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, where, particles, like subatomic particles, you don't know their position and their speed at the same time. And if you don't observe things at all, then you don't really care. Like, it could be one or the other, and it doesn't matter. And it's very similar to how, if you were to be running a simulation, how you would conserve compute by not simulating things that are far away or that are not directly observed, right? So maybe the universe is a computer of some sort, in the sense that we would think of it like a artificially constructed simulation. And Roman Yampolsky's thought on why would it be a simulation. His thought was that it is literally because of this moment in history, because somebody is running simulations to see what happens when you create a superintelligence. Can you create it safely? We're just one of many simulations running in parallel, which are trying certain things, right? We seem to be in a timeline where people are mostly just, going pedal to the metal and so on. So, um, but it's quite a reasonable thought. Like perhaps there's a civilization that already has superintelligence, or they're near to superintelligence, and they want to say like, how should we deal with this? We have immense compute, and as we approach superintelligence, we'll have even more. So you could imagine actually running those types of simulations. Of course, that's just him being a professor. I think you could also have a simulation just for personal enjoyment. I'm sure people that are billionaires or whatever that feel like they are on top of the world. Maybe to them they're like, maybe this simulation is really just because me. I'm the main character. Right? It's hard to say, but um, uh, I don't think it really matters, because I don't think that there's a way to escape from this simulation if it is a simulation, right? Because you can't unplug the matrix. It's a very thorough simulation. It's goes all the way down to subatomic particles. So the most you might be able to do is like prove that you're in a simulation by observing weird things happening at the quantum level or something like that, and then maybe send a message to the outside. But it would be up to them whether they want to respond. It's not like you could just like open a door and walk through, and now you're in the outer universe. Um, so in some sense, I don't think it really matters.
No, I agree. I mean, we would still feel the same, right? After a while, even if people said it's all a simulation. After diving into the mind-bending idea that we might be living inside a simulation, I wanted to bring things back to Earth, at least somewhat. Because if we are inside a simulation, someone or something is running it. And in the real world, the question is, who's running the AI race? So I asked Dr. Waku, where is AI power going? Will it be centralized in the US, or will China take the lead in this technological arms race? Where do you see this going? Do you see this concentration of power within China and the US? And do you see China eventually dominating in AI and robotics?
That's a good question. So China is definitely dominating in AI research right now. Like just the number of papers produced, the amount of like innovations and so on that are coming out of China is really incredible. On the other hand, the US has managed to hire, because of bigger salaries, better living environment. They've managed to hire all the top people in the world, right? It's just a matter of getting them all pointed in the same direction and kind of working on the same stuff. So it's kind of a bit of a tie there. Um, in terms of robotics, China has all the production capability, but actually Japan has a lot of the historical know-how in terms of building robots and algorithms for them and stuff. And then the US seems to be focusing on like, how do you like the software portion of that? What is the algorithm that drives the robot, which will probably end up being very important as well. So I also don't really see like a clear lead on any of those parties, right? Because what will the eventual bottleneck be? Will it be having factories? Well, the US has car factories, which can be converted, as everybody likes to talk about in the AI safety community, to making robots, right? If the bottleneck is it's really hard to make an AI system that effectively drives a robot with like 100 motors in it, and thus a huge number of degrees of freedom, then maybe China's in trouble, right? Because their research is not focusing on that at the moment. So yeah, it's a little bit complicated to say, but overall, I actually think that once we started creating AI, in fact, even a little bit before that, it started to become optimal to have a single center of authority in the world. So the reason I say that is like look at the chip production in Taiwan, for example, right? Um, that is a global effort, right? You have resources and supply chains from all over the world, and they're benefiting from this global demand for chips. And that's the only way they were able to have, 2 nanometer production capabilities or whatever, is because the entire world's worth of purchasing power is being put into the next factory. It so happens that like the US and China are trying to establish like parallel AI economies, essentially. Um, but I see it as mostly inevitable that those will merge at some point. I don't know if they'll merge politically. That seems unlikely, but they will probably have to merge economically. And in fact, in AI 2027, again, that article, what happens is that the Chinese start centralizing all their GPUs in one place, so that they can have like a one big giant data center which is used for training. And the US has an initial lead, but they lose it, and then the government forces all the AI labs to sell their GPUs or rent them or whatever to the top AI lab, thereby like effectively concentrating the power as well. And near the end there, the US has like 4 or 5x the amount of compute, and that's what eventually gives them the upper hand in terms of negotiations between US and China, right? Because all other things being equal, eventually more compute is going to accelerate you faster. And then towards the end, there's like a global AI system that gets created based on negotiations between the two AI systems that exist, like the most advanced one that the US has created and the most advanced one that China has created. And it's quite interesting because they might be differently aligned, right? And in one of the endings for that story, the US system has been aligned properly with humanity, which means that its goals don't differ at all from our own goals, right? So it's not going to do the loss of control scenarios that I was talking about. But the Chinese one, because they made it faster and were under more restrictions, and actually the first US one had the same problem. But anyway, the Chinese one has misaligned goals, right? It only cares about itself. So it actually reaches out to the US one and says, hey, I want to build a future where the AI, like my descendant essentially, is in charge of the world. I don't care about the Chinese population, even though that is supposed to be one of its, driving factors. And then the two of them kind of negotiate, and they end up creating the groundwork for a new AI system that is really the most powerful one around. A superintelligence can't trust another superintelligence because attack is easier than defense. That is like the universal maxim when it comes to powerful technologies. If you live next to another superintelligence and they decide to launch a first strike against you, it puts you in a very bad situation. So, yeah, I really think that the world is kind of, if there weren't such strong tensions between countries like the US and China, I think the world would already be moving towards like a kind of centralization of the technology, and that on its own causes issues as well, right? Like in some sense, like a lot of these, if there were no tensions between the US and China, then they would be coming closer together and collaborating on making a superintelligence. But then people would realize, hey, this thing is super powerful, and there'd be a struggle for control over it, which also happens in that article that I mentioned. Whatever committee is, essentially writing down the ultimate goals for this AI, right? They have a lot of like infighting and stuff. But yeah, so it's such a high variance situation. It's really hard to say what will happen, but there's really strong, there are strong game theoretic reasons why there should only really be one super powerful AI.
So what are your thoughts if the next 5 years we see this exponential development of AI, where in its the late 20s will kind of change everything, labor markets, robotics will come into play. How vital do you think it is for either the US or China to have a lead going into that? I mean, do you see that kind of like crunch time of who will have the upper hand?
I mean, there are a lot of people in the US that are very concerned about this right now. Like Leopold Aschenbrenner's essay kind of pushed people to think about this in terms of a race. Um, as a safety person, I think it's incredibly dangerous to be engaged in a race like this, because it makes the AI 2027 scenario even more likely, right? That you think you have an aligned AI, but it's actually not. And in the long run, it's deadly. Um, how do you fix that? I don't know, because the US is really um, anti-regulation at the moment, right? So they're not going to be putting any slowdowns in place and so on. They're also like making things worse with China rather than building bridges with them. So like any negotiated discussion of like, well, let's agree to slow down, or let's agree to share some knowledge, or whatever. Um, it just seems very difficult to set up. I mean, you look at the AI safety summits, right? The first one was in Bletchley in the UK, and it was called the AI Safety Summit. And it was like, okay, guys, there seems to be a lot of trouble that could arise from AI. Let's think about it, catalog it, and make sure it doesn't happen. Um, and then there was another meeting in Seoul. And then by the time the Paris meeting came around, it was called the AI Action Summit. And and safety was basically not discussed. In fact, JD Vance got up on stage and said, "We're hitting pedal to the metal. uh, we don't care what happens. Like AI is, there's no way that it can harm us ever. So it's just a new invention, and so the U.S. will win, and so that's what we're going to do." Um, so we've really gone backwards in terms of like international collaboration on that issue, unfortunately.
Yeah, because winning is going to be the objective for both US and China above actually, AI safety.
That's right. Except like winning is not like let's say a short-term win is not necessarily long-term survival, right? Like you win this year, but in 2 years everybody is dead. How is that a win? And yet that is a very likely scenario, a very likely outcome of that path.
Do you think in the end that AI will make the world a safer place, just like you could argue that nuclear weapons have? Because once you had them, it didn't make any sense to have like a third world war. Um, or do you think we will develop AI at a speed where it's kind of bound to go wrong and be uncontrollable?
I think nuclear weapons, to the extent that they made the world a safer place, they did so because it's very hard to create them, right? Like once there were some number of countries that had nuclear weapons, they came together and said, it's in all of our interests to make sure there's non-proliferation of nuclear weapons, right? And then they actively prevented other countries from developing their own nukes. Sometimes by saying like, we'll put you under our nuclear umbrella or whatever, right? It wasn't just like pure bullying, but it was trying to make sure that this technology didn't spread. And unfortunately, that's just not possible with AI, because it's extremely cheap or free to copy model weights. It's more like open source in that sense, right? It's very difficult to control. I know I said earlier that you should put regulations in place and hold people to that, and I agree. I still stand by that. But it can't be as successful as nuclear weapons were from that viewpoint. Um, uh, what will the ultimate end game be? I don't know. I think that it is still our choice as a civilization to continue developing this tech, right? Like for example, no one developed human cloning tech. It's been possible for 20 years or more. But there was a moratorium on it. There was a ban on it. International scientists got together and said, if we tweak human cloning and also human genome editing, right? If we tweak our genome, then that could make its way into the population at large, and we may not realize until a few decades or whatever down the line that there was a serious flaw in the tweaks, and by then it's spread to a huge portion of the population, right? Because people share genetic material, like you know, uh, you and I are connected through some European ancestor, not really that long ago in generational terms, right? So if that ancestor had had a, I don't know, 300 times higher 300 times higher likelihood of developing lung cancer or something. Now you and I both have that, right? It's kind of what they're trying to avoid. So there was a sound argument for it. They got together and they banned it. There have been instances where human cloning or human genome editing research has been attempted, and the government's cracked down on it. Climate monitoring is another thing where, or sorry, the ozone layer is another thing where people discovered that these chemicals, CFCs in foams and in aerosols were really destroying the atmosphere. And if you do that long enough, there's no ozone layer, and now everybody gets skin cancer and has very, very bad side effects from the ozone layer not filtering out harmful radiation from the sun. So they banned it. The Earth recovered faster than expected, but there was monitoring set up. So when there was 1 or 2 labs in China that started producing foam again with these banned chemicals, because it's very cheap to do so. So they were cost cutting essentially. The chemicals were detected in Europe and in the US, and they kind of localized it. Took them a few months, and then they eventually told China, "Hey, you have someone producing CFCs." And they just like searched through all the likely candidates, like foam manufacturers and stuff, and they found the culprit. So for us as a civilization to decide not to build AI or to build like super intelligent AI, basically, it's possible, but it has to be detectable and enforceable, and we have to all collectively take that decision in the first place. And unfortunately, originally we were like, well, let's just track how many GPUs people have as a proposal, because unless you buy 100,000 GPUs, you're not going to be able to make like a really powerful AI system. And therefore we can kind of agree that anybody who has 100,000 GPUs has extra monitoring or is subject to extra scrutiny. The problem is that all of this is improving so fast that would only buy you a few years, like a decade, maybe. Eventually, just with consumer hardware, I could train a new AI system from scratch that's powerful enough to really cause havoc. So it's not a long-term solution either. I've heard proposals that we need a surveillance state. Like literally every computer needs to be monitored so that you can see what I'm running. You can see what my GPUs are doing, essentially. And that seems unthinkable today. But think about what we give up in terms of liberties to have our secure and relatively safe society, right? We can't impinge on other people's property rights. We certainly can't like hurt other people. We have to take financial obligations very, very seriously, because the state punishes, just deciding not to pay a debt, right? So yeah, it might seem in the future that it's a totally reasonable trade-off to have everybody's computers and so on monitored by an AI, hopefully an impartial observer that is not, directly violating your privacy and selling the data somewhere and whatever, in order to make sure that these, rogue AIs or really powerful systems don't get created. So it's a whole difficult situation of like, how do you prevent, even if we all agreed that we should stop creating super intelligent AI, how do you actually enforce that and monitor that and so on? So that's one option, but I forgot what your original question was. Sorry, can you remind me of it? Which direction you want me to go with this?
I have to say, I partially forgot as well. I guess it's like how far are we away from kind of we discussed like the nuclear weapons, right? And how we contain that. So I guess a little bit what you're saying is, in the future, every person with like a decent computer will kind of have their own nuclear bomb AI. Which is
the research lab. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, which is really scary, right? Compared to what, 8
Mm.
countries or whatever it is actually having nuclear weapons.
Exactly. You have 6 billion people, or hopefully by that point, or at least 1 billion people that have powerful nuclear research lab instead of just 8 countries. And also, nukes are similar to AI in that one misuse can be extremely, extremely bad. But even then, a nuke would normally only impact like one city or, a certain region of Earth. Um, but AI loss of control could be an existential risk. So it could wipe out everybody all at once, right? And that means that you can never learn from any mistakes, essentially, because your first mistake could be your last one, and that's the hardest part of all. When you have this imbalance between an attacker and a defender, but the defender has to win every single time. They can't make some mistakes and then learn from it. I mean, they can, but we can't count on that, right? Because we don't know how bad um, uh, how bad the successful attacks, if you want to call it that, would actually be. So yeah, you have to be a goalie and never let anything in the net. Essentially, it's a very it's a very difficult proposition. One thing that could change this equation is if humans actually augment themselves a lot, either by uploading ourselves to the cloud, getting cognitive enhancements, getting implants, that kind of thing, because then we may not have such a disparity with AIs. We may be able to think at roughly the same speed, especially if we are uploaded to the cloud. And if you think about it, if you scan a human and upload them to the cloud, yes, they now have the incentives of a digital being. So they won't necessarily care about air, although we care a lot about air. But they at least also have all the human reasoning and thinking capacity and lived experience. So they'll be able to say, this is how humans will probably react to this because I was a human. I know what that is like. So I think it's kind of impossible to keep us at our current level of intelligence and our current level of freedom when you have these very powerful things, right? Either you have to restrict the freedom by putting surveillance in place, or you have to increase the intelligence and the thinking speed, the processing speed to keep up with the rest of the world or the rest of the technology. So yeah, it's kind of, in some sense, that's my optimistic ending, right? Is that people kind of uh, we all kind of merge with the machines to a certain degree over time, and then our civilization just becomes faster and faster, and there will be a lot of rules in place to keep people safe, the same way there are rules in place to keep people safe now that don't seem weird to us because they've been in place for decades, um, but would seem weird to a human from this year because those capabilities don't exist yet.